Hello. I'm very pleased to be invited by the Institute for Global Economics to talk about how global politics will be altered by the current COVID-19 pandemic. We are facing a major juncture in world politics, which is likely to lead to major long-term impacts. However, I need to emphasize at the start that the full nature of these impacts will not be known today. If we look back at any of the major global crises we have faced, like the Great Depression or the September 11th attacks or the 2008 financial crisis, the consequences flowing took years to materialize and would never have been predicted at the outset. For example, one of the long-term impacts of the 2008 subprime crisis was the rise of populism in the US and Britain, a development that few people predicted early on. It is therefore safer to talk in terms of scenarios than making predictions. A beginning point for an analysis would be to understand what kinds of countries did either well or poorly in meeting the COVID-19 challenge. There has been a huge variance in health outcomes, which constitutes a natural laboratory of sorts for measuring national responses. Many observers have asserted that authoritarian countries have done better in dealing with the epidemic than democratic ones. A quick survey of states would indicate that this is a questionable correlation, however. There has been wide variance in the performance of both democratic and authoritarian countries. Some democracies have done quite well in meeting the challenge, including South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Germany, New Zealand, and Canada. Others have done very poorly, like the United States, Brazil, and Mexico. The reason that people believe authoritarian governments can handle COVID effectively is based on a bilateral comparison of China and the United States, the leading examples of different regime types, and indeed the US looks much worse. But that has to do with the specific social and political factors that apply in the US and not the fact that it is a democracy. What then are the important drivers of good performance? I would look at three categories of explanation. More important than democracy in controlling the disease is state capacity. That is, the number of doctors, clinics, health workers, and other professionals involved in the health sector, and the resources that they have available. One of the reasons that East Asia has done relatively well in controlling the disease has to do with the fact that the countries there, Korea, Japan, China, and Taiwan, all have strong centralized states and traditions supporting technocratic management of government. By contrast, such capacity is lacking in many parts of Latin America, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Developing countries in these regions could order lockdowns early on, but they have been unable to maintain them, which is why infection rates have been going up dramatically over the summer in these parts of the world. A second important factor is trust. Citizens must both trust the government and trust one another if they are to cooperate to defeat the virus. Compliance with difficult social distancing or shutdown orders will occur only if citizens believe that they are necessary and that the government ordering them knows what it is doing. In the United States in particular, there is a deep political culture that distrusts the state and a high degree of individualism that makes many people resistant to obeying orders. This has been very much on display during the epidemic as protests against quarantine orders have spread through many states, and resistance to mask wearing has been widespread among conservatives. A final factor is leadership. A country can have good state capacity and a compliant population, but if the person at the top does not make the right decisions, the country will suffer. We have seen many examples of poor leadership during the epidemic, beginning with Donald Trump in the United States, but extending to figures like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Manuel López Obrador in Mexico, and Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus. All of these individuals denied the significance of the virus, failed to take decisive action to control it, and as a result, had infection and death rates that were among the highest in the world. Societies that have all three conditions, strong state capacity, strong trust, and social consensus and good leadership, are the ones that have weathered the COVID-19 storm most successfully. One of the clear consequences of the epidemic is to shift the world's economic center of gravity from North America and Europe and towards East Asia. Since many East Asian countries have been able to control the virus, they have been able to restore economic growth rates to something close to pre-pandemic levels. The US and Europe, by contrast, are now heading into a second or even a third wave and will not see strong recovery until well into 2021. The epidemic is likely to widen the gap between the developed and the developing worlds. Although it appeared that countries in Latin America, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa were not as severely affected by COVID early in the crisis, their relative position has deteriorated rapidly over the summer. Weak capacity and distrust of governments and leaders has made it difficult to maintain shutdowns, and large parts of the labor force are in the informal sector and therefore disconnected from health benefits and other social protections. There have already been other negative political consequences of the epidemic. Many leaders have used it as an excuse to expand executive powers and silence critics. This has been going on in many countries. Viktor Orban in Hungary, for example, early on used the crisis to obtain emergency powers from his parliament. China's extension of its security law to Hong Kong and crackdown on protests likely would not have happened had the world not been distracted by the epidemic. Similar abuses of authority have occurred in India, the Philippines, Uganda, El Salvador, and many other places. On the other hand, there are possible good consequences stemming from the epidemic. COVID has relentlessly exposed bad leadership, since the relationship between poor governance and bad outcomes is clear for everyone to see. Alexander Lukashenko, the longtime dictator of Belarus, was one of those leaders who from the start denied the reality of COVID and as a result let the disease spread widely. Although it is hard to establish a clear causal connection, it is very likely that the mass protests against his rule that have been taking place ever since he stole a national election in August are the direct result of this failure. By contrast, democratic politicians like Germany's Angela Merkel and New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern have seen their popularity rise for their effective handling of COVID. In the latter case, Ardern's Liberal Party won an absolute majority for the first time in the New Zealand Parliament. Across Europe, populists have been in decline since they do not seem to offer any good alternatives for dealing with the crisis. It is not an accident that populist leaders like Trump, Bolsonaro, and Lopez Obrador have performed very poorly. Populists rely on personal charisma to win votes, and for that reason do not want to be associated with bad news or ask their citizens for sacrifices. They're good at manipulating facts and information and seem to have believed that they could fool their followers into believing the disease didn't exist. One of the effects of COVID-19 has been to expose this bad leadership and poor governance very ruthlessly, and one of the disease's consequences may be to prick the populist bubble. Let me now turn to the impact of the American election on November 3rd. One of the biggest uncertainties hanging over global politics is at the present moment concerns the American presidential election, which took place just recently. The Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, has clearly won the popular vote, as well as the Electoral College that actually determines the winner. However, due to a massive shift to mail-in and early voting as a result of the pandemic, vote counting has been very slow in many swing states. President Trump has mounted an unprecedented and irresponsible campaign to discredit late voting counting in the states that are likely to turn against him, and the Republican Party has geared up its legal machinery to mount as many challenges to the late vote counting as possible. If Biden is declared the winner, Trump will very likely continue to challenge the legitimacy of the election, and there are some doubts as to whether he will be willing to peacefully vacate his office. As of this moment, we do not know other critical election results. It is likely that the Republicans will retain control of the Senate, but the exact extent of their majority will not be known possibly until early January, when Georgia will hold a runoff election. There are also many down-ballot elections in states and localities that have generally been tending towards the Republicans, but it appears that the Democrats will continue to control the House of Representatives. These electoral results contain both good and bad news, both for the United States and for countries around the world that depend on it. The good news is that Trump will likely be a one-term president, and that President-elect Joe Biden will be able to restore American foreign policy to the kind of internationalist role that it has played for much of the past century. If Trump were to remain in office, almost all international institutions would be weakened. His former national security advisor, John Bolton, has suggested that the United States would leave NATO and other alliances would be treated in a mercenary way with further demands for burden sharing. Biden, by contrast, is likely to recommit to these relationships, as well as to have the United States rejoin international organizations and agreements like the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Accords. All of these actions are clearly within the prerogative of the president and could be undertaken relatively quickly in a new Biden administration. More broadly, by failing to re-elect Trump, the United States will have repudiated Trump-style populism and demonstrated that its constitutional system of checks and balances in the end worked. President Trump has many imitators around the globe, from Bolsonaro in Brazil to Duterte in the Philippines and Modi in India, and his failure will reflect on their behavior as well. The bad news, however, is that Trump did as well as he did in an election that many observers believed would result in a landslide victory for the Democrats. Trump's last-minute rallies in red states solidified his base and appears to have compensated for his losses among other groups, such as suburban women. He also did much better than expected with Hispanic voters, despite his strong anti-immigration stance. Even in defeat, his hold over the Republican Party will remain very strong for the foreseeable future. America's greatest weakness today is its polarization. The even division between red and blue states and voters has undermined governance on many levels, beginning with the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Public health practices like mask wearing have become political statements, with President Trump asserting to the end that the epidemic had been conquered in the face of evidence that this was simply not true. Polarization has exposed a vulnerability that other authoritarian countries like Russia and China have been quick to exploit, making use of social media and other new technological tools as weapons to exacerbate divisions that were already present in American society. While many American allies will welcome the election of Joe Biden, things will never go back to the way they were before 2016, with other democracies assuming that they would have strong American support. Because Trumpism has not been clearly defeated, American allies will understand that Biden's hold on power is tenuous and that the Republicans could make a comeback in 2022. The problem is not simply one of leadership, but resides in American society itself, and in the fact that so many Americans were willing to vote for Trump despite his obvious failures of leadership. The critical comparison that many international observers will make will be between China on the one hand and the United States on the other. While it is wrong to assert that democracies have done less well than authoritarian states in general dealing with the epidemic and economic recovery, it certainly is the case that the United States has done much less well than China. The United States had a chance to reverse perceptions of its relative decline with this election, but unfortunately this did not occur. But to repeat, the future is very unknowable. There are many factors that will affect a future Biden presidency, and he may have good luck in recovering from both the disease and from the economic turndown. And so, as I said at the beginning, we need to think in terms of both positive and also some very negative scenarios for what will happen to global politics in the coming years. Thank you very much for your attention.